as the fire crackles softly and shadows dance across the walls. Let yourself drift, your breathing slowing as we begin a journey into a land forgotten by time. Tonight, I'll tell you of a mysterious tale shared only in whispers. A story of a guardian dragon and a kingdom hidden beyond the reach of mortals. Imagine a place at the world's edge, where the mountains rise like ancient sentinels, and an old man seated by the fire tells travelers of a dragon who guards the secrets of a lost kingdom. Take a deep breath and settle in as we let this ancient tale carry you into a gentle, peaceful sleep. The Guardian. Dragon in a village forgotten by time, at the edge of the world where the sun kissed the horizon and never returned. An old man told stories. His voice was a whisper against the wind, barely louder than the rustle of dead leaves beneath ancient oaks. Travelers who stopped in the village found him sitting by a fire, his eyes reflecting flames that seemed far older than the hearth before him. Those who listened to his tales left with a chill in their bones, as if the words themselves carried something otherworldly. Among his many stories was one that seemed to hold more weight, more substance than the rest. A tale of a kingdom lost beyond the mountains that rose like jagged teeth against the sky. It was said that this kingdom, hidden from mortal eyes for centuries, was once the jewel of the world. Its rulers, wise and just, possessed knowledge beyond imagining. Treasures that could reshape the earth and secrets that defied time itself. But that was not the most curious part of the legend. No, the part that ensnared the minds of those who dared to believe in such fables was the dragon, the guardian dragon, a creature older than memory, tasked with guarding the entrance to the kingdom. It was said that only the worthy, those with hearts untainted by greed, could pass the dragon's test and find their way into the forgotten land. On the night our story begins, a traveler sat by the old man's fire. The wind had carried him to this forsaken village, drawn by little more than a whisper, a promise of something more, something beyond the mundane life he had known. His name had long since been forgotten, as if the world itself no longer cared for such trivialities. He was simply the traveler, a soul seeking something he could not name. The firelight flickered as the old man spoke, his voice low and rough, though it had been shaped by centuries of telling the same tale. "Beyond the mountains," he murmured, "there is a place where no light reaches and no sound can escape. It is a kingdom of silence, watched over by a creature who knows the weight of every heart that passes before it." The traveler leaned closer, his curiosity piqued. "A dragon?" he asked, his voice barely more than a breath. The old man's eyes gleamed in the dark, the flicker of the flames casting strange shadows across his weathered face. "A dragon, yes, but not just any dragon. The Guardian. It has watched over the kingdom since the beginning of time, allowing only those who are worthy to enter. Many have tried, but none have returned. Only the pure of heart can pass the trials it sets. The traveler's gaze drifted to the distant mountains, their peaks obscured by clouds that seemed to stretch beyond the heavens. His heart stirred, as if something deep within him was calling out, something that had been waiting for this moment all his life. "And if someone were to pass the dragon's test?" he asked, his voice barely concealing his yearning. The old man smiled, a slow, knowing curve of his lips. "If one were to pass," he said, "they would find a kingdom unlike any other, a place where time itself bends to the will of those who know its secrets. But beware, traveler. The dragon does not care for strength or cleverness. Its test is not one of the mind or body. It is the heart that it seeks to judge, and many hearts are heavier than they seem." Silence fell between them, the crackle of the fire the only sound that remained. The traveler felt the weight of the old man's words settle over him like a shroud. And yet, beneath the weight, there was a spark, an ember of hope that refused to be smothered. The old man turned his gaze back to the flames. "If you seek it, traveler, then go. But know this, once you begin the journey, there is no turning back. The dragon will find you, and once it does, your heart will be laid bare." The traveler rose, the firelight casting his shadow long against the ground. His path was set, though the destination was shrouded in mystery. With nothing but the legend in his heart and the mountains in his sights, he set off into the night, his footsteps swallowed by the wind. And so, the journey to the forgotten kingdom began. The traveler walked alone under a sky heavy with clouds, where neither stars nor moon dared shine. The wind, once a gentle whisper, now carried a chill that gnawed at his bones. His cloak flapped in the gusts, a solitary banner against the endless expanse of wilderness. There was no path, no road, just the ever-rising peaks ahead, jagged and foreboding, like the teeth of some ancient beast. For days he wandered through forests where the trees grew so thick and tall they blotted out the sun, casting the world in an eternal twilight. Shadows played tricks on his mind, turning branches into skeletal hands and rustling leaves into whispers that seemed to call his name. Yet, despite the eerie atmosphere, something deeper, more enigmatic pulled him forward. The legend of the forgotten kingdom was more than just a story now. It was a presence, a force guiding his every step. On the third night, as he rested beneath the boughs of a gnarled oak, the traveler felt the first sign of something watching. At first, it was subtle, a sensation like being brushed by an unseen gaze, a prickle on the back of his neck that made his skin tighten. He looked up, but saw only the dense canopy above, stars hidden behind a thick veil of cloud. The wind had stilled. The forest around him was too quiet, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The next morning he pressed on, moving deeper into the heart of the wilderness. Strange markings began to appear on the trees, spirals and runes carved long ago, their meaning lost to time. The traveler paused to examine one, tracing its curves with his fingers. The bark was cold, and for a moment it felt as if the tree pulsed with a slow, rhythmic heartbeat. He quickly withdrew his hand, unease curling in his stomach. As he ventured further, the world grew stranger. The air around him seemed to thicken, as though he was walking through the remnants of an ancient spell. His footsteps became muffled, absorbed by the earth beneath him. Occasionally he would catch glimpses of movement from the corner of his eye, shadows darting between trees, always just out of reach. But when he turned, there was nothing, only silence. By the 5th day, the mountains loomed before him, their peaks hidden in swirling clouds. He stood at the base of the range, gazing up at the towering cliffs. It was here that the journey became treacherous. The path, if there ever was one, had long since been swallowed by the wilderness. Jagged rocks and steep inclines turned every step into a struggle, and the traveler's muscles ached with the effort of climbing. On the 7th day, he reached a narrow pass, the only visible way through the towering mountains. The air grew colder as he ascended, the wind now howling through the cliffs like a chorus of lost souls. As he walked, the traveler noticed something peculiar. The higher he climbed, the more the landscape seemed to shift. The rocks took on strange shapes, almost as if they had once been sculpted into forms too ancient to understand. Faces, perhaps, or creatures long forgotten by time. At the top of the pass, he stood before a narrow gorge, its entrance flanked by 2 enormous stone pillars. Each pillar bore the carved image of a dragon, wings outstretched, mouths open in a silent roar. Their eyes, hollow and dark, seemed to watch him as he approached. A shiver ran down his spine. This, he realized, was no ordinary place. He had reached the threshold between the known world and the unknown. The wind quieted as he stepped forward, crossing into the gorge. Here, the air felt different, thicker, heavier, with the weight of forgotten ages. The walls of the gorge rose high above him, jagged and scarred by time. Yet as he walked deeper, the oppressive silence seemed to lift, replaced by a faint hum, a low vibration that seemed to come from the very stone around him. And then, as if summoned by his presence, a distant rumble echoed through the gorge. It was a sound too deep to be thunder, too alive to be the shifting of rocks. The traveler stopped, heart pounding, as the ground beneath him seemed to tremble. From far ahead, beyond the twists and turns of the narrow path, came a low, guttural sound, the breath of a sleeping giant. He had come this far, and now there was no turning back. With a deep breath, The traveller continued forward, the ancient hum growing louder with each step, the distant breathing of the guardian dragon ever present, like the heartbeat of the mountain itself. The forgotten kingdom was close, but so too was the creature that guarded its gates. The gorge narrowed as the traveller pressed onward, the walls closing in until only a sliver of the overcast sky was visible above. The air here was different, thicker, almost tangible, as though it had not been disturbed by a living soul in centuries. The hum in the stone grew louder, vibrating beneath the traveller's feet with each step, until it seemed to resonate deep within his chest. Every breath felt heavier, every sound muffled, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Around a final bend, the path opened suddenly into a vast shadowed cavern. The light was dim, filtering in through cracks in the stone above, casting faint beams onto the floor. The traveller paused at the entrance, his gaze sweeping over the immense space. It was both awe-inspiring and ominous, the kind of place where one could feel the weight of forgotten history pressing down upon them. The cavern's walls were etched with ancient runes and symbols, their meaning lost to time, but they radiated a quiet power that was unmistakable. At the far end of the cavern, half shrouded in darkness, lay the entrance he had been seeking. It was not the grand gate of legend, nor the towering doors of a lost kingdom. Instead, what stood before him was far more enigmatic. A simple archway of rough-hewn stone, barely wide enough for one person to pass through. Vines, dark and twisted, clung to the stones like veins of some ancient creature. It was as though the earth itself had tried to swallow the doorway whole, concealing it from those unworthy of passing through. Above the arch, a single rune glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. It was a symbol the traveller did not recognize, yet it filled him with an uneasy sense of knowing. He stepped closer, drawn by the soft glow, and as he did, the hum in the stone shifted. What had been a distant, low vibration now took on a distinct rhythm, like the slow, deliberate breaths of something slumbering deep within the mountain. The traveller's pulse quickened, the hairs on the back of his neck rising in anticipation. This was no ordinary passage. This was the threshold between worlds, the doorway to the forgotten kingdom. The silence that had followed him through the gorge broke, replaced by a whisper on the wind. A voice carried on the air like a forgotten melody. It was not in any language the traveller understood, yet the meaning was clear. Only the worthy may pass. He hesitated, staring at the archway, the weight of the legend pressing down on him. It was said that those who sought to enter the kingdom would face trials beyond comprehension, that the guardian dragon would awaken to test their heart, their spirit. Many had tried and failed, their bones left to bleach in the wilderness beyond. But the traveller had come too far to turn back now. The thought of retreating seemed impossible, There was nothing left for him in the world he had known. Only the kingdom, shrouded in mystery and silence, held the answers he sought. With a deep breath, the traveler stepped forward, his boots making no sound on the smooth stone floor of the cavern. As he approached the archway, the hum in the stone grew louder, more insistent, until it was a deep, thrumming pulse that seemed to synchronize with his own heartbeat. His hand reached out, almost of its own accord, brushing against the cold, ancient surface of the arch. The moment his fingers touched the stone, the rune above the archway flared with light, bright and sharp, casting the entire cavern in an otherworldly glow. The ground beneath his feet trembled, a low rumble that echoed through the cavern walls. From deep within the earth, the sound of shifting stone and crackling energy filled the air. And then, from the depths of the mountain, came the unmistakable sound of breathing, slow, deliberate, and ancient. The guardian dragon was waking. The traveler froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The archway before him seemed to pulse with life, the glow of the rune casting long shadows across the cavern. The air was thick with power, as though the very mountain itself had come alive in response to his presence. In the stillness that followed, the voice came again, this time louder, clearer, as though the mountain itself was speaking. "What do you seek?" the voice asked, its tone both commanding and curious, as if testing the very essence of the traveler's soul. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry, and answered in a voice barely louder than a whisper. "I seek the truth of the forgotten kingdom." For a long moment, there was only silence, the kind of silence that weighed heavily on the air, as though the mountain itself was considering his answer. Then slowly, the light from the rune began to fade, and the rumbling subsided, leaving the cavern in a deep, almost reverent stillness. The traveler stepped back from the archway, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The entrance to the kingdom lay before him, but he knew now that it would not open easily. The dragon was awake, and the tests were only beginning. The forgotten kingdom was within reach, but so too was the presence of the creature that guarded it. The guardian dragon, a being older than time, whose judgment would soon be past. The cavern had fallen into a silence so profound that even the faintest sound would have felt like a trespass. The traveler stood before the archway, his breath shallow, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel it now, a presence that had stirred beneath the mountain, a vast unseen force that seemed to ripple through the air, thickening it with anticipation. The guardian dragon was waking. The faint glow of the rune above the arch had dimmed, yet the air was still alive with a pulse, an invisible heartbeat that matched the rhythm of the traveler's fear. And then, from the depths of the earth, came a sound that shook the very bones of the mountain. A low guttural rumble like the growl of a beast too ancient to remember its own birth, reverberated through the stone walls. The traveller's legs felt heavy, as though the weight of the mountain itself had settled on his shoulders. He stepped back, his pulse quickening. From the shadows at the far end of the cavern, where the light barely touched, the darkness seemed to shift. There was movement now, subtle and slow, as if something immense was stirring beneath the surface of the world. Another deep rumble echoed through the space, and this time the ground beneath the traveller's feet trembled. Small stones skittered across the cavern floor, and a fine mist of dust drifted down from the unseen ceiling. The air grew colder, and with it, the sense of something vast and ancient pressing down on him grew unbearable. And then from the shadows, 2 points of light appeared, 2 golden eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They blinked once, slowly, and in that blink, the traveller felt as though the entirety of his soul had been laid bare. It was as if those eyes had seen everything, every secret, every regret, every hidden desire. He felt the weight of them settle on him, not as a gaze, but as a judgment. A voice, deep and resonant, filled the cavern, though the dragon's mouth did not move. It was a voice that seemed to rise from the very stone, a voice older than the earth itself, speaking in a language that was not of words, but of understanding. What do you seek? The question hung in the air, filling the cavern with a pressure that made it difficult to breathe. The traveller swallowed, his mouth dry, but he forced himself to speak. I seek the truth of the forgotten kingdom, he said, his voice steady but quiet. There was a pause, and in that pause, the dragon's glowing eyes seemed to narrow, considering him with a deep, almost palpable intensity. The silence stretched, oppressive and suffocating, and the traveller felt as though the air itself had thickened, making it harder to breathe. He knew that this moment, this test, was far more than a simple question. The dragon was not asking for an answer, it was weighing his soul, measuring the truth behind his words. Finally, the dragon spoke again, its voice a deep rumble that seemed to shake the very foundation of the cavern. Many have sought the kingdom, the voice said, slow and deliberate. Few have spoken of truth. Most come seeking power, riches, or the secrets of immortality. What makes you different? The traveller hesitated. He had no grand explanation, no profound justification for his journey. He had been drawn to the kingdom not for wealth or fame, but for something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. A yearning for knowledge, perhaps. A need to understand the world beyond what his eyes could see. And, in truth, it was a feeling that had driven him more than anything else. A pull that had started long before he ever heard the old man's tale. I don't know what makes me different, the traveller admitted at last. But I am not here for riches or power. I seek knowledge. I seek the truth that has been lost to time. The dragon's eyes seemed to gleam brighter for a moment, the golden light casting strange shadows across the cavern walls. The traveler could feel the dragon's mind probing his words, testing their weight, their sincerity. Time seemed to stretch in that moment. The stillness of the cavern punctuated only by the steady, deliberate breaths of the great creature before him. Then slowly, the rumbling voice returned. Truth is not a treasure easily found. To seek it is to walk a path that many fear. Few pass through the trials of the heart unscathed. The dragon's eyes flickered, the glow within them intensifying. You will be tested, traveler. Your heart will be weighed, and the truth you seek will demand a price. Are you willing to pay it? The traveler felt a chill run down his spine, but he did not waver. He nodded, his voice firm despite the fear coiling in his chest. I am willing. The cavern seemed to shift again, the shadows deepening as the dragon's form became more distinct in the dim light. Its massive body, coiled and ancient, moved with the slow grace of a creature that had known eternity. And with that movement, the air thickened once more, vibrating with the power of an ancient force awakening. The dragon's gaze held him for a moment longer, and then, with a deep rumble that seemed to shake the earth itself, it spoke again, its voice a low, resonant growl. Then let the trial begin. The dragon's final words echoed through the cavern, reverberating like the toll of a distant bell. The traveler stood still, bracing himself for what was to come. The air seemed to grow denser, pressing against his skin like a weight. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, all was silent, unnervingly still, as if the entire mountain was holding its breath. Then, without warning, the world around him shifted. The cavern, the glowing rune, the great dragon, all dissolved into shadow. The traveler blinked, disoriented, as his surroundings blurred and darkened. For a moment, he thought he had been plunged into a void, an abyss where light and time ceased to exist. But then from the edges of the darkness, shapes began to form, faint at first but growing clearer, more defined with each passing second. He found himself standing in a room he recognized, the small, weathered home of his childhood. The fireplace crackled softly in the corner, casting a warm glow over the simple wooden furniture. The air smelled of old books and firewood, the scent stirring memories long buried. It was a place he had not seen in years, a place he thought he had left behind forever. But this was not just a memory. This was something more vivid, more immediate. It felt real, too real. Before him, standing in the soft glow of the fire, was a figure, a man, older now, but familiar, his father. The traveler's breath caught in his throat, his heart pounding in his chest. His father had died years ago, taken by illness before the traveler had the chance to return home, before he could say the things left unsaid. Guilt had gnawed at him ever since, a weight he had carried in silence, The figure in front of him turned, and the traveler's heart clenched. His father's eyes, deep and filled with that same kindness he remembered, met his own. "You've come back," his father said softly, his voice like a distant echo from a time long past. "But why now? When you were needed, you weren't here." The words struck like a dagger. The traveler staggered, his legs heavy, as though the weight of the earth pressed down on him. He wanted to respond, to explain, but no words came. His mouth felt dry, his voice trapped in his chest. All he could feel was the overwhelming tide of regret, flooding through him like a wave he could not escape. His father stepped closer, his expression unreadable, the flickering firelight casting shadows across his weathered face. "You were always searching, always looking for something beyond," he continued, his voice calm but laced with sadness. "But what about here? What about us?" The traveler closed his eyes, the guilt pressing down on him like a shroud. He had left in search of answers, of purpose. But in doing so, he had abandoned the ones who had mattered most. His heart ached, the wound of that choice still fresh despite the years that had passed. "You seek the truth," his father said, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. "But truth comes with a price. What are you willing to lose?" The room around him seemed to shift, the edges of the scene blurring like smoke in the wind. His father's face began to fade, dissolving into shadow, and the warmth of the fire gave way to a cold emptiness. The traveler reached out, desperate to hold onto the image, to grasp the fleeting memory, but it slipped through his fingers like mist. Suddenly, the room was gone. He was alone again, standing in the void. The silence was suffocating, pressing in from all sides. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the vision lingering like a shadow over his soul. But before he could gather his thoughts, another scene began to form. This time it was a moment from more recent memory. A crossroads. He stood looking down two paths, one leading back to the comfort of home, the other toward the unknown. He had chosen the unknown, the road that had brought him here. But in doing so, he had left someone behind. A woman, someone he had loved deeply, but had chosen to leave when the call of the forgotten kingdom had grown too strong to ignore. She appeared before him now, her face a mixture of love and hurt. Her eyes, filled with questions she had never asked, bore into his soul. "Why did you leave?" Her voice was soft, but it cut through the silence like a knife. "Why wasn't I enough?" The traveler felt the weight of those words like a blow to the chest. He had no answer, no explanation that would make sense. All he had was his choice, the choice that had led him down this path, away from everything he had known, away from her. "I had to," he whispered, though the words felt hollow, empty. The scene shifted again, dissolving into shadow, leaving him alone, once more in the void. His heart felt heavy, burdened by the ghosts of his past, by the choices that had brought him here. And then, through the darkness, the voice of the dragon echoed once more, deep and resonant, like the rumbling of the earth itself. The heart is a maze of choices. What you seek lies within, but every path comes with a cost. Are you prepared to bear it? The traveler stood in silence, the weight of the trials pressing down on him. He had come seeking the truth, but now he understood. Truth was not found in the world beyond, but in the heart. And the heart, with all its regrets and mistakes, would always demand a price. The void around the traveler remained dark, thick with an oppressive silence that seemed to stretch into eternity. His heart still weighed heavy with the ghosts of his past. But he had not faltered. The dragon's voice echoed through the darkness once more, its deep, rumbling tones like the very earth speaking. You have faced your heart, traveler, but courage is not found in the past. It is the fire that burns in the present. The next trial awaits. The shadows around him began to stir, rippling like the surface of a dark lake. Slowly the blackness gave way to light, but it was not the comforting glow of a hearth or the gentle rays of dawn. It was a harsh, flickering light, firelight. The traveler blinked, adjusting his eyes, and found himself standing at the edge of a great chasm. Before him stretched a path of fire. Flames danced along the narrow bridge, licking at the air with tongues of burning red and orange. The heat was overwhelming, suffocating, and the flames roared like a living creature, hungry and wild. The bridge was long and perilous, flanked on either side by an endless abyss. There was no other way forward. This was the trial, the test of courage. The traveler's heart raced, every instinct in his body screaming for him to turn back, to flee from the inferno before him. But there was no turning back. The dragon's words echoed in his mind. Courage is not found in strength, but in the will to face the impossible. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward. The moment his foot touched the bridge, the flames surged higher, as if sensing his presence. The heat was unbearable, searing his skin even from a distance. Sweat dripped down his brow, stinging his eyes, but he kept moving. His steps were slow, deliberate, each one carrying him further into the fire. The path seemed to stretch on forever, the other side lost in the haze of heat and flame. As he walked, the flames grew more intense, swirling around him in violent gusts. The roar of the fire was deafening, drowning out his thoughts. Each step felt like a battle, his legs trembling under the strain of the heat. The fire was not merely a physical challenge, it was a test of his resolve, a measure of his spirit. Halfway across, the fire changed. The flames twisted and coiled into shapes, forming illusions, visions drawn from his deepest fears. Out of the fire, great beasts rose, their forms wreathed in flame. Their eyes glowed like embers, and their jaws snapped with the heat of a forge. They were creatures of nightmare, born from the darkest corners of his mind. A dragon made of fire. Its wings, like burning ash, swooped low, roaring as it circled him. The traveler froze, his courage faltering for the first time. The fire dragon descended, its molten jaws opening wide as it lunged for him. He could feel the heat of its breath, the deadly power of its flame. And for a moment, he was paralyzed by the sheer terror of it. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to run, to flee back into the darkness where the flames could not reach him. But there was no escape. To flee was to fail. To retreat was to surrender to the fire within his own heart. The fears that had always kept him from moving forward. The words of the dragon echoed once more. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the will to face it. With a deep breath, the traveler stood his ground. The fire dragon loomed above him, its wings blotting out the light. Its molten eyes locked with his, and for a moment it seemed the creature was more than just flame. It was a reflection, a mirror of his own fear, his own doubt. And in that instant, the traveler understood. The beasts of flame, the inferno that surrounded him, were not his enemy. They were the embodiment of his fears, his uncertainties, the shadows that had haunted him for so long. He raised his head, his gaze steady, and met the fire dragon's eyes. "I am not afraid," he whispered, though his voice was barely audible over the roar of the flames. The dragon paused, its fiery maw inches from his face. For a moment, the world seemed to hang in stillness, the flames freezing in mid-air. And then, with a sudden burst of heat, the fire dragon dissolved into ash, scattering on the wind. The other beasts, too, began to fade, their forms crumbling into the fire from which they had come. The path before him cleared, and the flames that had roared so violently now flickered softly, no longer a threat but a guide. The traveler exhaled, his body trembling with exhaustion, but he did not stop. He continued forward, step by step, until at last he reached the end of the fiery bridge. The heat began to fade, replaced by a cool breeze that soothed his scorched skin. He had passed the test of courage, but the weight of what he had faced lingered. His fears had not been vanquished, but he had learned to face them. The dragon's voice, deep and resonant, echoed once more in the stillness. Courage is not the defeat of fear, but the strength to walk through it. The traveler stood at the edge of the abyss, staring into the darkness ahead. He had passed the second trial, but he knew the journey was far from over. The forgotten kingdom was close, but so too was the truth it held, and the price it would demand. The traveler stood at the edge of the chasm, the cool air brushing against his skin, a stark contrast to the searing heat he had just endured. The path of fire lay behind him, now dim and distant, But his trial lingered in his heart. He had faced his fears, crossed a bridge of flame, but he sensed that something far greater awaited him. Ahead, the darkness stretched, deep and unyielding, like the mouth of an ancient creature waiting to swallow him whole. The voice of the dragon had fallen silent, but the presence of the guardian still hung heavy in the air, as though it watched his every move from the unseen shadows. The traveler knew the trial of the heart had been only the beginning. Something deeper, something more profound lay ahead. He took a step forward, the ground beneath him shifting ever so slightly, as though the earth itself was alive, breathing with the rhythm of the ancient force that slumbered within it. The shadows around him began to stir, swirling like mist, and within them, shapes began to form. Images, fleeting and ethereal. They rose like fragments of dreams, half remembered and elusive, barely there, but undeniably real. As the traveler moved deeper into the shadows, the shapes grew clearer. He saw figures, people long gone, their faces etched with the passage of time. They were not ghosts, not in the traditional sense, but memories, echoes of a forgotten age. They walked through the air like phantoms, their expressions serene, their movements graceful. They spoke in whispers, voices carried on a wind the traveler could not feel, their words too faint to understand. But one thing was clear. These were the inhabitants of the forgotten kingdom. Their presence filled the air with a quiet reverence, a solemnity that spoke of an age long past, an era when wisdom and knowledge reigned supreme. The traveler's heart quickened as he watched them, not as a spectator, but as someone who was witnessing a truth he had long sought. He felt the weight of their existence, the depth of their knowledge, and the power they had once wielded. And then, from the shadows, the dragon's voice returned, soft at first, but growing louder, resonating through the air like the distant roll of thunder. "These are the ones who came before you," the dragon said, his tone heavy with ancient knowledge. "They sought the kingdom, as you do now. But they were not here for riches or power. They sought truth, wisdom beyond the mortal realm. And they found it, at a cost." The traveler watched the figures as they moved through the shadows, their faces calm but distant, as though they were only half present in this world. He felt a deep sense of connection to them, but also a profound sadness. There was something lost in their eyes, something that had once been alive, but was now forever out of reach. "They found the kingdom," the dragon continued, "but in doing so they became part of it. The forgotten kingdom is not a place to be ruled or conquered. It is a place of eternal knowledge, a place where time does not exist as you know it. Those who enter become bound to it, their lives woven into the fabric of its existence. To enter is to leave behind the world you once knew, The weight of the dragon's words settled over the traveler like a heavy cloak. He had always imagined the kingdom as a distant land, a realm beyond reach, but still tangible. But now he understood. It was something more, something far more elusive and profound. It was not a kingdom of gold and stone, but of knowledge, of secrets hidden from the eyes of the world. The traveler took a deep breath, his mind racing with the implications of what he had heard. To enter the forgotten kingdom was to transcend the limits of time, to become part of something eternal, something that stretched beyond the boundaries of mortal existence. But with that knowledge came a price, one that could not be undone. As he stood there, watching the figures move silently through the shadows, the dragon's presence seemed to envelop him. The air thickened, vibrating with the weight of the truth that had just been revealed. The kingdom exists beyond time, the dragon said, its voice a deep, resonant hum. Those who seek it must understand. To gain its wisdom, you must leave behind the world you came from. You will no longer belong to the mortal realm. You will belong to the kingdom, and the kingdom will belong to you. The traveler felt a chill run down his spine, but he did not flinch. He had come this far, seeking answers, seeking the truth. And now that the truth had been revealed, he realized it was far more than he had ever imagined. "What will you choose, traveler?" the dragon asked, its voice low and knowing. "Will you take the path that leads to the kingdom, or will you turn back, returning to the world you once knew?" The traveler stood in the silence that followed, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision before him. The figures in the shadows continued to move, their presence both comforting and distant, like the ghosts of a forgotten age. He knew that his choice would define not just his future, but the very essence of who he was. And as he stared into the darkness ahead, the path to the forgotten kingdom waiting before him, the choice lay in his hands. The dragon's secret had been revealed. The traveler stood on the threshold, his mind swirling with the revelation of the dragon's words. The forgotten kingdom, long sought by many, was not a place of conquest or wealth. It was a realm beyond time, a sanctuary of eternal knowledge, where those who entered became part of its endless, silent existence. The weight of this truth pressed down on him like an invisible hand, cold and unyielding. He had always imagined the kingdom as a destination, a place he could reach, touch, and perhaps leave. But now, he knew that entering was not just a choice, it was a surrender. The shadows shifted again, revealing the path ahead. It was narrow and winding, carved into the rock as if by some ancient force. The walls of the cavern pulsed with a faint ethereal light, casting everything in shades of silver and grey. At the end of the path stood a simple stone archway, much like the one he had seen before. But this time there were no carvings, no runes. It was bare, unadorned, almost humble in its simplicity. And yet, It radiated a quiet power. The air around the traveler seemed to hum with anticipation. The figures of those who had come before him lingered in the periphery, watching silently from the edges of the shadows. Their eyes, distant yet knowing, seemed to reflect his own uncertainty, as if they too had once stood where he now stood, at the door to the forgotten kingdom, faced with the same choice. The dragon's voice rumbled through the stillness once more, low and steady, like the shifting of the earth beneath him. You stand before the final threshold. Beyond this door lies the forgotten kingdom, a place where time does not touch and wisdom flows like water. But know this, once you cross, there is no return to the world you knew. The traveler's heart raced, his mind filled with 1,000 questions. What would it mean to leave behind the world? To live beyond time, bound to a kingdom that existed only in the quiet spaces between moments? He had sought truth all his life, wandered far from the familiar in pursuit of it. But now that he stood on the edge of that truth, the enormity of it felt overwhelming. What would you give for knowledge? The dragon asked, its voice no longer a question, but a whisper of understanding. The price is always greater than you think. The traveler stepped closer to the archway. Beyond it, he could see nothing but a faint mist, swirling in delicate patterns that seemed to beckon him forward. The air was cooler here, almost serene, and the hum of the mountain seemed to grow softer, as if inviting him into its ancient embrace. He could feel the pull deep in his chest, an almost magnetic force drawing him toward the door. And yet, he hesitated. He thought of the life he had left behind, the faces, the memories, the places he had wandered through on his long journey to this moment. He thought of the choices he had made, the paths he had taken, and the ones he had left behind. He had lived his life searching for something greater than himself, something that would give meaning to all the questions that had haunted him. And here it was, within reach, waiting to be claimed. But at what cost? The dragon's presence seemed to fill the air around him, not as a threat, but as a reminder. To cross the threshold was to step out of time, to leave behind the fleeting, fragile world of mortals. He would become something more, something eternal, but he would also lose the life he had known. The faces of those he had loved would fade into the distance, the memories of his past life growing faint, like whispers on the wind. The figures in the shadows shifted, watching him with silent eyes. They had made their choice long ago, and now they belonged to the kingdom, woven into its very fabric. Their faces were serene, untouched by the passage of time, but there was a distance in their gaze, a separation from the world they had once known. The traveler took a deep breath, his heart steadying. The path to the kingdom was clear, and the decision lay in his hands. He could cross the threshold, enter the kingdom and become part of its endless wisdom. Or he could turn back, return to the world of fleeting moments, where life was fragile and uncertain, but also full of wonder. He stepped closer to the archway, the cool mist brushing against his skin. The dragon's voice echoed in the stillness. One final time. The choice is yours, traveler. The forgotten kingdom awaits, but only those who are truly ready may enter. The traveler stood before the door, his hand hovering just above the stone. He could feel the pull, the promise of knowledge, the allure of eternity. And yet, beneath it all, he felt something else, an understanding, a quiet truth that had been with him all along. Forgotten Kingdom was not just a place, it was a choice to let go, to surrender to the endless flow of time, or to embrace the fleeting moments of life where every heartbeat, every breath, held a kind of beauty that could not be found in eternity. And so, with his heart clear and his mind steady, the traveler made his choice. The mist parted, and the door to the forgotten kingdom stood open. The path before him, no longer shrouded in mystery, awaited his final step. The traveler stood on the precipice of the forgotten kingdom. The open archway before him, a gateway to a place beyond the reach of time, beyond the grasp of the mortal world. The cool mist that swirled through the opening seemed to beckon him, pulling him toward the answers he had sought for so long. His heart ached with the weight of the decision he now faced. The ancient dragon's final words still echoed in his mind. The choice is yours. For a long moment, he did nothing but stare into the mist. It was not that he was afraid, though there was a kind of fear in him, a deep uncertainty. No, what held him back was something else entirely. A strange sense of calm had settled over him, quieting the storm of thoughts that had raged inside since the beginning of his journey. Now, with the forgotten kingdom within his grasp, a different clarity emerged. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, the mist curling around his feet. The air was cool, almost soothing, as if the kingdom itself was inviting him to cross the threshold. He could feel the power of the place, the ancient knowledge that pulsed through the air like a heartbeat. It was as though the very fabric of the world had shifted, making room for him, offering him a place among its endless mysteries. But with each step, a memory tugged at him, a quiet, persistent voice from the past. He remembered the old man's tale, whispered by the fire on that distant night when his journey had begun. He remembered the stories of those who had come before, those who had passed through the trials only to disappear into the kingdom, never to return. And he remembered the faces of those he had left behind, the loved ones whose lives had moved on without him, whose stories had continued even as he chased the shadows of the forgotten kingdom. The path to the kingdom was clear, but for the first time, the traveler began to wonder if this was truly what he had been seeking. All his life, he had longed for something more, something beyond the fleeting moments of ordinary existence. He had believed that the kingdom, with its endless knowledge, would offer him the answers he had sought. But now, standing on the threshold, he realized that the kingdom was not just a place of answers. It was a place where time stood still, where life became a part of the eternal flow of wisdom. And in that stillness, there was something missing, something precious. He thought of the faces he had seen in the shadows, the silent figures who had passed through the trials before him. They had gained the knowledge they sought, but they had lost something in the process. Their eyes, though calm, were distant, disconnected from the world they had left behind. The traveler wondered if they remembered the lives they had once lived, the people they had loved, or if those memories had faded, like whispers in a wind long forgotten. Another step forward, and the mist thickened around him, wrapping him in its cool embrace. The door to the kingdom was open, waiting for him to pass through. He could feel the pull, the promise of a knowledge, the allure of eternity. And yet, beneath it all, he felt the weight of the world he had left behind, the fleeting beauty of the life he had known, with all its imperfections, its joys and sorrows. The dragon's voice echoed in his mind one final time, low and resonant. To enter is to leave the world behind. There is no return. The traveler stood at the edge of the threshold, his hand hovering above the stone that marked the entrance to the kingdom. He closed his eyes, his mind quiet. He had come so far, seeking the truth. But now he understood that the truth was not found in endless knowledge or the stillness of eternity. It was found in the moments that made up life, the fleeting fragile moments that could never be captured or held, only lived. And so he stepped back. The mist parted as he withdrew from the archway, the cool air fading as he returned to the warmth of the cavern. The figures in the shadows watched him silently, their expressions unchanged, and the distant glow of the forgotten kingdom began to dim behind him. The traveler turned, the weight of his decision settling over him like a cloak. He had chosen the world of fleeting moments over the stillness of eternity, the life of uncertainty and imperfection over the endless wisdom of the forgotten kingdom. And as he walked away from the doorway, back toward the path that had brought him here, he felt a deep sense of peace. The dragon's presence lingered in the air, a quiet hum that seemed to resonate with the very walls of the cavern. The traveler knew that the kingdom would remain, waiting for those who sought it. But it was not his path, not anymore. As he reached the mouth of the cavern, the wind outside greeted him, carrying with it the scent of earth and distant rain. The sky, which had been dark and heavy when he entered, was now streaked with the faintest hints of dawn. He stepped out into the open air, breathing in the cool freshness of the morning. The traveler smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. He had found the truth he had been seeking, not in the forgotten kingdom, but in the journey itself, in the choices he had made, and the life that awaited him beyond the mountains. And with that, he turned his back to the path he had walked and began the journey home.